Thank you very much for coming along to this session. We feel slightly guilty breaking up the flow of the excellent afternoon conversations. But let's kick off on our next panel. So the objective of this panel is to explore a little bit around the demand side and the policy side. So we touched earlier today around whether or not corporates really understand what they mean when they want a nature positive strategy. Are they going to the tailor and saying, just make me look good? No idea what color, what shape, cut of suit I want. So the objective of this session is to have a candid look and share some experiences of what we're seeing on the demand side, and also talk a little bit around partnerships, practice, and the extent to which policies have been effective for this. So to kick it off, we'll do brief intros. My name is Wei Ng. I've spent about 25 years scaling up tech and data-enabled solutions, including in the climate space. I'm currently senior advisor to Barker Fund, an African impact investor. And prior to this, I was at KPMG, where I was the global head of ESG tech and innovation. On a personal note, I'm a bit of a water sports junkie, so I'm passionate about SDG 14, but recognizing also land and sea are interlocked. So very interested in the broader topic of nature. Over to you, Pete.
Hi, everyone. My name is Pete Ward. I'm head of corporate partnerships at the Natural History Museum. And my team work with companies looking to support the museum in a variety of ways, but also exploring how the museum can support companies, in particular our scientific research capabilities. We have about 350 scientists and 170 PhD students on the books, researching our collection of over 80 million specimens, and our research spans the geosphere and biosphere, and my team work with our scientists to try and bring that research into corporates to help them on their journey to being more nature positive. Thank you.
So Christian Edwire, I work at Bloomberg as our product manager for natural capital and biodiversity. I've been at Bloomberg for around 14 years now. And so in that time, I've really managed to figure out what we do, which is the intersection of finance and data. But actually through personal interest, I'm just absolutely riveted by anything living and natural systems. And so fundamentally, my responsibilities are figuring out what it is that our clients want and need for understanding nature-related risks, and then finding the various different bits of data that we need to deliver it.
Thanks, Christian. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Vian Sharif, and I always say I'm a double agent, but now I actually think I'm a triple agent because I, like many of us, have a deep love of nature. I think you wouldn't be in this room if you didn't have something about nature that inspired you or you wanted to feed into the work that you're doing. And I'm the founder of a nature data company called NatureAlpha, and also the head of sustainability at FNZ Group, a $1.5 trillion wealth technology platform. And most recently, after a 10-year quest, I'm a trustee of a charitable trust called the Tairona Heritage Trust, which represents the Kogi Indians of Colombia, whom I hope you'll get to meet if some of you come to COP. So a wonderful privilege for me to have been in the finance industry now for almost 20 years. And alongside that, to have understood the rise of interest and understanding that if we don't address nature loss, then there will be a systemic problem, and that feeds into our economic risks and so on. And so the privilege we all have is to be at this nexus of finance and data to help influence our investment system. How can we start to use data to influence that? And then also, how has the policy landscape helped to shape adoption of this kind of awareness and the sorts of tools that we're going to be discussing today?
Great stuff. And Hannah.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Hannah Skeates. I'm at NatureMetrics, where I lead our finance sector interactions. And if we are fessing up about timescales, I've been involved in the finance sector for over 20 years now. And I think if I look back, I can see a lot of transformations over that time. I was originally involved in some of the scaling of indexing, then of ETFs, exchange-traded funds. I worked on the mainstreaming of ESG and into climate at places like BlackRock and Wells Fargo, just over the bridge there. And so I decided a few years ago that I wanted to really think about nature properly, and I actually went back to university to study ecology and aquatic conservation, and so I'm involved now to be on the other side of the equation, thinking about how do we measure nature, how do we measure it sort of at source, and then how can we build that in and bridge the conversations to all the different types of financial institutions and finance players that are out there, so that we can have fantastic action.
Terrific. So let's kick off. We talked a little bit earlier today about the demand side, supply side. The real economy is where the tire hits the road, where we can make a real difference. What are some of the more forward-looking corporates in the real economy doing? Perhaps start with you, Pete, in your kind of role speaking to corporates, many of whom are signatory to TNFD.
Thanks. Yeah, so I have some experience as well. I have a corporate background. So prior to the museum, I was at Sainsbury's for about 14 years, and I was a buyer. And so one of the challenges that I faced, I used to buy chocolate, and back then two things happened. One, I put on a lot of weight, and two, I realised that supply chain transparency was a challenge, and trying to understand where you were getting things from. You could go to a processor, Barry Callebaut, whoever was supplying your chocolate, but tracing it back to farm started to get quite difficult. So supply chain transparency is a challenge, and companies can do it to a point on certain commodities, but actually getting to the farms gets a bit trickier. And so I'm well aware of the challenges that happen in that space. And so what we're seeing across different sectors, and the museum is talking to all kinds of different sectors. We're talking to financial services, we're talking to mining, we're talking to FMCG, we're talking to pharmaceuticals, and they're all kind of facing this similar challenge around, one, there's a plethora of metrics out there, and what the hell do we use? Not every metric is there's no one number for nature, so which numbers do we use? How do we use those numbers to derive insights? And so there's all these kind of challenges. And so different sectors have different levels of understanding and progression in this space based on legislative compliance or a horizon scan of what might be coming. So in mining, there's potential around stranded asset risk when you have to declare biodiversity positive plans to extract assets out of the ground. So the likes of Rio Tinto and those kind of players are well aware of the importance of gathering data, and they know where their sites are because you can't really miss a mine. Whereas other sectors are less progressed, there's less board level understanding, and they want to be helped on that journey. And so I think when the rubber hits the road, as you say, I think the scope is around identifying areas of global consolidation where people are sourcing similar stuff and engaging in pre-competitive collaboration to maximise and share understanding who's succeeding doing what in different companies, and how might we pull together our knowledge to make the biggest impact in the right places the fastest. I might pause there.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. And perhaps if I bring you in, Hannah, around some of the work that I know NatureMetrics has been doing with some of the corporates out there to help them start to understand what a biodiversity strategy might be.
Yeah, absolutely, and it does speak to some of the similar topics. So you can imagine companies are now waking up, they're hearing about TNFD and a number of these other initiatives and thinking, okay, what do I do, how do I do it? And there are differing levels of maturity across each sector, and so one of the things that we and others do, and we have a sort of free version of this on our website, is sort of take companies, and this can be from a variety of different sectors, through the steps of where are they on that maturity scale. So things like, have they thought about a strategy? Do they have any commitments? Who is accountable? Are you starting to think about transition and transformation? Because really, this is, if we think about the sort of big picture of what we're trying to achieve here in the Holton reverse, there's an element of how do you transform your business model, much like with the climate conversation. How do you transition your business model to something that's more nature positive? And then what do those roadmaps look like? And what level of nature literacy and education is there within your corporate. And so you can take each of these pieces step by step and work through it and say, within my sector, who is doing good stuff, who is role modeling this, who's trying to pilot or prototype. And then as you sort of get through the various different stages, that's when you start to get to the real practical, okay, yes, now I know what I need to look at, where my sites are, what do I need to measure, and how does that measurement really occur? And that's when we get to the kind of practical element of what we do from a site level measurement perspective.
Great stuff. And I like the fact that you mentioned education in the company. So many of the large cap corporates I've been speaking to be honest, they've spent the last 12 months thinking about carbon and water waste. What does double materiality mean? They haven't started really to grasp the nettle of nature yet. You talked about forward-looking companies. Anyone in the panel, do you have a sense of which perhaps are the top 3 sectors that are thinking more proactively about this?
I think, so one thing I would say is that if you look at the data, we just spoke about the process that companies are going through to start with having some potentially governance structures before you eventually going on to measure. If you look at where the data is now, we find, let's say in the palm oil sector, around 400 companies which are involved in it. If you look at some measure of governance, maybe around 100 companies with some governance, and then traceability or certification, you really narrow down from a whole universe who are involved in something to only a very small minority, around 10% or so, which are disclosing something which is like really serious metric that you can trace year after year. And that's even if you think that the certification and traceability is any good. So I do think that the data plays out that companies and corporates are on that journey, and there's far more of them who are towards the beginning of it.
Maybe I could add to that. So really following in what you've said, Christian, is when we did an analysis, I think, of the top or the largest by market cap 3,000 companies in the world, probably something like 30% of them have got some form of policy or they've considered that. But even that is a step in the right direction. And I would expect to see that start to grow and proliferate, especially with the onset of Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures awareness. And also on the practical point, just to touch on what you said, the TNFD is useful because it gives those practical steps and helps to define what you're looking for. So hand in hand with the capacity building that many of us are doing, just understanding that there is something out there that's landed. It's called TNFD. It's not actually, it's the same structure as TCFD. The conversations, as you said, are not massively dissimilar. There's governance aspects, there's scenario and risk aspects, and there's some metrics. So starting on that process and how to do that, I think I'm encouraged by the fact that we will have greater adoption.
So this is London Tech Week. I was going to say Climate Tech Week, but it's London Tech Week. Let's touch a little bit around how data and technology can help. So Sylvia Earle, for those of you who are fellow SDG 14 advocates, National Geographic Explorer, Aquanaut, inspirational lady, and she said, this is our best last chance. By which she meant it's our best because never in the progression of humanity have we had so much knowledge and technology to try and solve for the problems. So interested to get your perspectives on how nature tech and data can help. Perhaps, Christian, do you want to talk a little bit about the Bloomberg index that you've developed with the Natural History Museum?
Yes, certainly. So I think it's fair to say that we, and just echoing what Vian said, through 2023, with things like EUDR coming through, with TNFD, there's sort of documentation being written with Nature Action 100, defining companies to engage with. We're moving to 2024 of action. EUDR kicks in, TNFD early adopters start reporting, and so to feed that, you need data, and we at Bloomberg, we sit at that intersection of financial markets and of data. And so when we think about what we can do to help in this space, there's a lot that we do really well already. Like we understand what it is that companies do if they're in high-risk sectors. We understand where it is that they're operating, and to the extent that publicly disclosed data allows supply chains. But what we don't do is the biodiversity data. We don't know where the biodiversity data is, and that's where, for us, we saw synergy with the public sector. And a lot of the really good biodiversity data is held in public institutions, which are, Pete described the amount of scientists that the Natural History Museum have. They are credible institutions with really credible scientists and produce credible content. And Pete would probably better describe their biodiversity intactness index. But fundamentally, our work is to marry it with asset data that we collect in order to identify, one, the companies operating in areas which are intact and potentially should be protected, or they should definitely be looking after those areas. And secondly, what we've not quite done yet, but intend to do, is companies operating in areas where biodiversity is being or has been lost in the recent past, and potentially should have looked after those areas a little bit more carefully. And the final thing I'll just add is that's a really interesting piece of information, a piece of data in itself. But actually, when you take a load of other pieces of data around that, like what the company does it have the relevant governance structures in place, etc., you start to build a bigger holistic picture of whether the company is, if it is a really risky company, is it doing the right things about it or not, as the case often may be.
That's great. We touched on the plethora of data that could be sourced, and I want to come to you, Hannah, because that data set is quite macro in nature, and you touched earlier about kind of location-specific data that you guys look at. Mm-hmm. Could you share a little bit more around that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this morning there was a bit of a conversation around the halt and reverse. And so if we think about the big picture objectives of how should a corporate understand what it's doing relative to halting certain practices and then reversing nature loss, many of the initiatives at the moment have had quite a big and understandable focus on the sort of pressures, the negative pressures and the drivers of loss. One of the sort of, and that's almost like the GHG emissions if we're thinking about climate. On the flip side, what do we need to measure here? And in climate, we're measuring the temperature, we're measuring climate change, and you can do that quite broadly. For biodiversity, we are measuring the state of nature. And I think it's that question around how do you measure the state of nature? What is it that corporates can do to build that picture up? And so there we're thinking about, okay, the right ways, using all the science and the academia to get into ecosystem condition measurement, and that in and of itself is looking at things like species and looking at the habitat. And NatureMetrics was founded on the idea that the process of taking environmental DNA, so living creatures, they leave behind traces of DNA, and it's a sort of forensic science type way of going into the landscape or the seascape, and taking samples and using that DNA, that environmental DNA, to start to build a picture of the whole tree of life, and that can be that's present there, and that can be really transformational in terms of doing the ecological measurement and monitoring. It sort of takes it from the traditional going out, sending experts out into the field, that can be time consuming and costly and sometimes quite difficult to do, into taking some samples, sending those back to the lab, and suddenly having a huge amount of species information that can be then pulled together with the appropriate academic and scientific thinking into what are the species that we have here. And this then it's the basis of the kind of accounting that a company would do around, I know what I've got, and I know then, hopefully over time, the extent to which that is either maybe, hopefully not, going down, staying flat, or maybe moving in a positive direction. And this is the type of work we're doing with entities to say, this is now possible. it can be done, the measurement can be done, and then how do you then sort of add that up and think about actions that you can take sort of across your whole portfolio that will make sense and make sense in the landscape as well.
I love that description, tree of life. And I'll come back to you on that point. But Vian, could I bring you in here? Because FMZ provides the technology backbone for trillions of dollars of investment. How mature is the integration of kind of nature into those investment considerations?
It's not mature. And in fact, the whole reason for founding NatureAlpha was a very selfish one, because I wanted nature data in all of our platforms. Yeah. So I wanted 20, 30 million end investors to understand not just the impact of their investments from a sustainable perspective, but to get deeper into that. So if you particularly have a deep love of nature, or perhaps it's human rights that's your thing, maybe it's diversity that's more important to you, maybe it's corporate governance issues, but whatever it is that you care about as your value, I wanted you to be able to see that when you were looking at your investments, whether you're making investments or the huge weight of money that is in retirement assets. So it was purely selfish to create this nature data because I wanted to see the nature data in my investments. And so what we see today is the ingestion of this data now into those journeys, wealth management journeys. I highlight the work of Ethic as well in the room. Incredible shop there, looking at how you integrate values-aligned principles into your investments. So you can have an investment product that entirely matches the things that you care about. Things like the EU regulation have sort of forced this issue. It's very granular about how you match an appropriate investment. If you're going to your advisor or you're investing in your 401k or whatever, it's very, very granular how you match the kinds of investments that are advised as yours to your preferences. Really granular. And so we actually couldn't have done that without the nature data that we have today. The level of granularity that the regulator is asking for, specifically in the EU, means that we have to have this data. So I'm very positive about now some of the largest brands in the world starting to use these, exposing this nature position that you have in your portfolio.
And where'd you source that data from, and how developed are those data sets? Because I remember seeing on your website, you've got a whole host of different KPIs that you're starting to track.
Yeah.
What are the, A, how developed it is, and B, what are the remaining challenges, if any, around further developing that out?
Well, it comes back to your point about technology and whether this is indeed the one moment in time we could ever have done this. And I was actually not supposed to be on this panel. My good friend Drew Purvis, who leads biodiversity innovation at DeepMind, was meant to be here. And he's a scientist who went into machine learning, is now leading Google DeepMind's efforts in the area of biodiversity. Anyway, the point being, we now have access to satellite data which is accessible. We can process that data. We can process that data over time, temporally. We have eDNA, incredible amounts of data that are coming through at the ground level. We have ground truthing data. That's just the geospatial stuff. Then we have an incredible amount of financial data, corporate data. What are companies reporting in their reports? Where are the news reports about incidents that they've had, which are nature-related incidents? So actually, we are at this moment in time, if we add generative AI, large language models onto this, is there ever could there be a better moment for doing this work and improving the baseline data that we have? I don't think so. And then we're only at the stage of descriptive. So what's so beautiful about the work that the Natural History Museum is doing is that they're starting to take that step into predictive. And that's where this is all going. If I'm an investor or if I'm a company, I don't just want to know where I am today. I want to know that the decisions I'm making based on the information I have today are going to mean that my company is more valuable, more successful, more resilient in the future. That I'm going to invest $10 today and get $1 million out in my Tesla or my Nvidia or whatever in the next 20 years. That's where we're going.
You touched on some of the regulatory drivers for this. Given the topic of the panel, how well do you sense is the public-private stakeholder collaboration going in relation to policy, in relation to regulatory agenda? What kind of anecdotal evidence can you share with us? What's been your experience so far?
Well, look, there are many people in this room that are far more qualified than me, Marco Lambertini and others in the room, who can talk to this as they're much closer to policymakers than I am. But actually, we have been invited to the table as part of a number of discussions around how policy needs to evolve so that the private sector can move in the direction that is useful for society in the future. So I would say that there's been a great desire for the creation of appropriate frameworks, TNFD being one of them. It was just a thought in 2020. It is now landed. It's being used. It's being adopted. There's a big push to have it become mandatory at some stage, or at least integrated with TCFD. But how do we include the Global South? How do those discussions happen? That's a very interesting dialogue that the Global Biodiversity Framework and COP16 be very interested to see how that pans out.
Thank you. Thoughts from others in the panel? Anything to add?
The museum obviously works quite closely with government. We have a director of policy who works alongside counterparts at the likes of DCMS and DEFRA. And we advise UK government on their approach to COP. Completely agree, COP16 will be interesting from a policy perspective, global biodiversity framework coming into play, and looking at those component indicators and complementary indicators that will form the basis of how corporates can start to report. That's where you're getting your line of sight of the kind of metrics and what they do. So I would look to that, the TNFD for sure as a starting point, and also how those component and complementary indicators are starting to come together, what they do, what do you need as a corporation to see and report on, where do you operate, and which metrics are best suited for what you're trying to do. So, there's already a list that exists of these out there, and policy will start to bring together the ones, you've got your headline stuff about 30 by 30, etc., but underneath that there's some really helpful starting points to understand where policy is likely to be going and the tools that you will use to meet those legislative sort of requirements.
I mean, the other example of public-private partnership is obviously what the two of you have been doing together, at Bloomberg and Natural History Museum, a bit of bromance going on there. How has that worked in practice? What's gone well? What could be improved?
What's gone well is that we had no idea what the bloody hell we were doing because we're a museum. And, the BII, as amazing as it is a very small number of scientists in a cupboard who got very stressed about how much attention suddenly was on them because they had this metric that people realised was awesome. And Bloomberg really helped us understand a lot of, we didn't know about derived product or the terminal or any of this. We had no idea. And Bloomberg and a few others talked us through, this is how it works. We didn't know about licensing, this, that and the other. We were very, our job was data and looking at nature and understanding how these metrics can be as scientifically robust. But we were very in our infancy in terms of understanding how to engage with this market because it's just not in our wheelhouse. So Bloomberg and others that we've talked to and people, we do have a good senior leadership team that can help with us. David Craig is a trustee of the museum, gives us a lot of guidance as well. Really helped us understand, what is the demand? How should we be structuring this data? How can we reconcile the need to bring in some money to fund the work that we want to do and the developments that need to happen versus making the data as accessible as possible so that we don't gate it off too much for other sectors that want to assess it. So that was really helpful for us just to educate us in terms of doing business with the likes of a Bloomberg and to shape us up for other sectors that we want to engage with. And what do the asset managers want to see? What is useful about the data? What's less useful? What's the granularity needed? When might the predictive stuff become very useful? What the temporal nature of it needs to be? Yeah, so I think those were all very helpful pieces of guidance that we were pretty in the dark about before we were having these kind of conversations.
And I think just perhaps from the other perspective, from the Bloomberg side, it's just been so fascinating, and I'm amazed every time I speak to some of the scientists behind the Biodiversity Intactness Index and the thoughts and the scientific rigor on data collection and processing that goes into it. And I think the good thing with working with the public sector is that you know that fundamentally the goal is to make the best biodiversity data, and the investment that we make goes into making that data better. I think so that was all really...
And importantly, commercially useful as well.
We hope so. I mean, it's just out now, but we hope it will be very commercially useful and successful, of course. And then I think from the other side, and you sort of touched on it, obviously Bloomberg has its philanthropic arm. That's not me. So I think we have to just work carefully together to understand each group's different motivations, but eventually come to an arrangement, an agreement that works for all, and hopefully for all of you out there in the market, or certainly our customers and those using data sets, provide something which helps with mitigating nature-related risks and eventually with reversing nature loss.
So getting the 5-minute signal, perhaps if we do a kind of reverse order wrap-up, Hannah, starting with you, what would you most like everyone in this room to do after today?
Yeah, just to build on what you said there, it is very much a multidisciplinary question, and there is a huge amount of knowledge in the public sector, in academia, in science, and so this isn't so much a need to build that basic information because the knowledge and the framing is there. It's about transferring that into new arenas and not starting from scratch. And so what I would love for people to do here is start to ask the question about where you are touching nature, either you directly or indirectly. Have you thought about how much nature there is and how to measure it? And if you were going to do that, who would be the right people to help you think about how to measure nature? And my hint is you don't have to start from scratch. There's lots of information there.
Yeah.
I would just say take the next step. And I say that because there are people in this room, because most rooms I'm in, there are people who haven't actually taken the first step, but they are ready to. So they've done reading or they're interested in it, but they're right at the beginning of their journey, so take the next step. But then also seasoned individuals who've been working at the pinnacle of this issue. You know, if we are going to achieve SDG 14 or 15 or the GBF, the targets, let's take the next step to make sure we do get there.
Christian?
I think for me, the message would be that science has been thinking about this issue for a long time and knows a lot more than private markets. So whether it's eDNA, whether it's, I believe you work with Oxford University, whether it's us working with the museum, I think that fundamentally working and basing, looking at the risks in science is fundamentally important, and the best is housed within the public sector.
And bringing us to a close, Pete.
I would say definitely identify people that you can talk to and think laterally about who might not be obvious. A lot of people don't think of the museum because everyone thinks of us as having dinosaurs. They don't think we have a biodiversity intactness index. So
I like your dinosaurs.
Yeah, they're a great strength of ours, but they're also the first thing people say if you stop them in the street. They don't say, oh yeah, they've got 350 scientists. They don't think that. So there will be other organisations like us that probably are doing amazing stuff that are just not that well known. And sectors that have overlap of expertise, and people that are doing great stuff at engaging their boards that others might be struggling with, where you can learn from how you did get a couple of Neds to join Chapter 0 to understand about nature or whatever. So I would say there's that. And then secondly, probably not trying to boil the ocean with this, just get started. It's a massive job, but, think about a supermarket. If they just focus on 2 or 3 commodities, probably go quite a long way to establishing nature positivity and not trying to focus on every single thing. In time that wouldn't need to happen, but we can go a very long way by just starting small in terms of the things you might look at that have actually a disproportionately big impact, the sort of 80-20 rule. So yeah, I would say talk to each other and don't feel like you have to do everything at once, because I'm sure many can't because of the size of teams generally looking at this.
Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, Top Tier Impact, for organising this event. Look forward to the next panels. Thank you. And thank you, panel.